across the board from day one, digital became a top priority for us. And the way we wanted to look at digital was not just through the lens of communication, through the lens of Facebook and Twitter, but really through a pretty wholesome perspective on how all the many things it can do for a campaign. So, you know, of course, we used it as rapid response. We used it to ensure that, you know, the president, the first lady, the vice president, all had a voice, whether it was on Twitter or it was on Facebook, and they were regular in their communication. They were building not just fans, but a deeper relationship with people that want to learn more about them. But we were also using it to organize and to create a sense that what you were doing offline, on the ground, was the same experience that what you would do online. And that's something that's been a great hurdle. Even for us in 2008, we really weren't able to match that together. So we were oftentimes in a situation where the volunteer experience on the ground was totally disconnected from a volunteer who might want to organize online, or maybe couldn't get to a local office. And because of that, we were less efficient. The experience was less enriching for our volunteers. And so we spent a great deal of time figuring out how you marry those two experiences and make them one. An example of how we were successful in this is anyone that was making phone calls anywhere across the country to our volunteers, whether they were in a battleground state, whether they were in a state calling into a battleground state, whether they were in an office or they were in their own home, all were using our voter contact tool, an online portal where everyone was putting in, you know, they would get a name, they would be putting in the information about how that call went. All of that information would be generated back into the same database, and it was a process that allowed people to have the same experience they would have in an office on their own. And that really allowed us to have more trained volunteers and a better experience overall. We also, though, recognize the importance of the internet itself. And the importance of the internet itself is certainly that it is as much about what we can do to communicate on behalf of the president or the president directly communicating as it is what our individual supporters are doing to communicate to their own networks. We believe every individual is an opinion leader in their own lives. At the core of our campaign, of the core of our philosophy on how to organize, it is community-based. We build neighborhood teams that are based on neighborhoods, that are based on giving people leadership within their own communities, their own neighborhoods, with the idea that if you are talking to your family or your friends, you are far more impactful than if I, a staff person for the campaign, was talking to someone I didn't know. That idea is, you know, as old as any idea in politics, and certainly not groundbreaking. But even though Facebook and Twitter are relatively newer technologies, that core idea is still the same. The president had over 33 million Facebook followers, and that was very important. But the thing that was more important to us was that those Facebook followers were friends with 98% of all Facebook users. And so for us, it was more important for us to identify the friends and fans of the president to then communicate to their own networks. We created programs, one in particular called Target Sharing, and it allowed us to identify within people's networks, if they opted into this, to say, okay, you know, here's an issue that's really important and it's taking place in battleground states. Here are a list of people that are your friends that we know live in battleground states that we think it'd be a great idea if you shared this article with. And it made it very easy. They popped up their faces. You know, we connected an article and they sent it off. The same thing with voter registration. We would say, here are people in your universe that are likely to be unregistered based on the data we had. And so we would like you to encourage them to get registered to vote. Something like that, clearly people had heard how important it is to register time and again. But if your friend or you know, a mentor of yours says this is really important to you, the value of that conversation is far greater. And so even though we were doing this online, it really matched with the core principles of how we organized on the ground.
I said a few words about Facebook. We were quite poor on Facebook. I think Barack Obama was about 40 million, that's it? Yeah. we were about 150 50,000 people. It was quite awful, but without without any impact, because Sarkozy with his 500,000 people, it didn't work. For Twitter, it was quite different. We reached the number of 326,000 people, and it was very interesting, because François Hollande didn't like Twitter. So, but a girl called Ariane was always with François Hollande, and she always tweeted what he did during the campaign. And so it was a very popular thing, because every hour or every minute you knew where François Hollande was. After we were quite original, because it was a huge discussion. We had two websites, an official website and another website called Tous Hollande. It was a website for activists, and it worked pretty well. We had a lot of discussion with Joe Spar and so on, and everybody said, but you're crazy. you have to get just one website, but it was much more comfortable for us, because the official website was perfectly clean, no spurity, no problem. But the other website, the website for activists, was quite trash, but it worked well. And we also used a lot emails, and we profiled people and so on. If you were interested in culture, you received an email about culture. If you are in Strasbourg, you received an email about Strasbourg. And we did a lot of A/B testing and so on, but we did it with Blue State Digital. During this campaign, video clips didn't work a lot. It was quite astonishing, because in 2007, video clips were very popular, but not this time. For example, Ségolène Royal, the former socialist candidate, reached more than 20 million videos, and this time for François Hollande it was about 3 or 4 million videos. I think it's because of broadcast news and what in France we call TNT, and everybody in France now can see the equivalent of CNN or something like that.
And it's no coincidence, I think, that if you look back over, say, previous periods of huge technical innovation in what communication methods political campaigns use, that it's been the scale that's driven that. So what made radio and TV become extremely popular with political campaigns in the early 20th century? It wasn't really that politicians had been sitting around before thinking, you know, oh, it would be really nice if instead of, you know, using the printed flyers that were previously very common, if people could hear my voice rather than see the words. It was because radio provided a very effective way of one person speaking and literally millions of people being able to listen. And TV similarly provided that mass communications option. And that problem of scale is one that is getting, in a way, is getting worse, partly because populations continue to grow, even in countries like Britain with relatively slow population growth compared to other countries. But that issue about, you know, how many votes do you need to win continues to, sort of the number continues to grow, to creep up. And also a problem, I think, because one of the possible solutions to that problem of scale is just completely off the political agenda. Because one way of saying, well, 80,000 people, one person, how do you possibly do it, is to say, well, let's have more politicians. And certainly the number of politicians per head of population varies hugely between countries. I mean, people involved in local government in Britain often look on quite enviously to the number of local politicians and indeed the levels of power that they have in France, for example. So I think different countries are at different places with this problem scale, but what is really not on the political agenda in any country is people saying what we want to introduce are hundreds more politicians. So we've got growing population, number of politicians not going up, that problem of scale getting more and more pressing. And it's why I think if you look at some of the first uses of digital technology and online campaigning back in the 1990s and then into this century, why some technologies didn't really take off. Instant messaging is a good example, you know, back from the early days of AOL and MSN, AOL Instant Messenger and so on, through to then things like BlackBerry Messenger and now most recently things like WhatsApp. If you look at it from a technical rather than a political perspective, instant messaging in its various forms has been hugely successful. There have been very big companies, very large user bases. You may have seen in the news earlier this week that WhatsApp is now saying it has a larger regular user base than Twitter. So massively successful technology, almost not at all taken up in political campaigning, because the problem with instant messaging is it doesn't let you do that one-to-many communication in a terribly efficient or effective way. It's really good at one-to-one communication amongst a small group of people, but when it's one person trying to reach your 80,000, or indeed on a national scale, one person trying to reach people in the millions, it doesn't work, it doesn't scale, and hence, for all the success of instant messaging in all sorts of other fields, very little take-up in the political sphere.